Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY. It's great to have you here and I hope you enjoy the video. In this episode I'll be making a segmented bowl with an epoxy resin insert. So without further ado, let's get into it. To begin with, I used a jointer to get a side and edge flat and perpendicular on 5 pieces of sapele. The timber I buy comes in random sizes and lengths, so I tend to use whichever pieces are closest to what I need. Then each piece was passed through the thicknesser to get them to the required sizes. To be honest, I tend to only worry about one dimension, that being the depth. I aim for around 27mm. This is a bit oversized to give me something to play with when I sand the glued up rings. Then using the table saw, I cut the segments. This bowl was going to have 5 rings, but I decided to change the design and only use 3. Each segment is cut at a 10-degree angle on either end, and each ring requires 18 segments. Then each piece was sanded to clean up the edges, and after that I could assemble the rings. Making the rings is a fairly straightforward process. I glued up 6 segments at a time, making sure I got plenty on. Then I formed a rough circle and used a hose clamp to hold it all together and squeeze the joints nice and tight. For note, it's quite important to do this on a flat surface. Unfortunately, my bench is covered with lumps of epoxy, which made getting the rings flat quite difficult. I've since sanded it down, so hopefully it'll be better next time. I'll just show one of the rings being done, the other 2 were done in the same way. Next I made the solid base. For this I roughly cut a circular piece of sapele on the bandsaw. This was then fixed to the lathe using the coal jaws. I levelled the base, then set to and cut the mortise. For this I used the 1/4-inch parting tool to define the outer edge of the recess, cutting down to a depth of around 6mm. Then I cleaned out the inner waste material, cut the dovetail with a dovetail cutter and added a few decorative rings. I followed this with cleaning up the edge of the blank. I was heading for an overall diameter of around 170mm, but it wasn't a critical measurement, so near enough was good enough. I turned the blank around to finish cleaning it up, then I refixed it in the coal jaws, sanded just the underside from 80 to 600 grit, and added a finish. It's the next day and the 3 segmented rings are ready for sanding. Once again I used the drum sander to flatten and level each side. And because the rings are not as flat as they could have been, it took a few more passes than usual to get them just so. Off camera I'd cast the resin infill piece. This had been done in 3 different colours, blue, gold and pink, and once released from the casting mould, it too needed to be passed through the drum sander to level each side. With all the pieces sanded and turned, the blank could be built. I glued up the lower section first, beginning with the larger ring. I applied a thick layer of Titebond 2, the second ring was placed on top, half bonding the segments, then a few dabs of hot melt glue to hold everything in place, then another layer of glue, followed by the base piece, again held in place with more hot melt glue. Weights were added to squeeze the joints, and it was placed to one side to cure overnight. Next I glued up the upper section. For this I used rapid curing epoxy mixed with black mica powder. After bonding the resin feature ring to the top segmented ring, I added some weight and this was left to cure. Another day has passed and the two pieces can now be bonded together, again using black coloured rapid setting epoxy resin. Once the two blanks were aligned, I added some weight and 30 minutes later it was ready to be fixed to the lathe. I fixed the completed blank to the four-jaw chuck, and as you can see from the wobbling lathe, it wasn't very well balanced. So I kept the speed low at around 550 RPM and began removing the waste material, gradually getting the workpiece to round. For a start I worked on the sapele rings. Using a 3/8 bowl gouge, I roughly shaped each ring, and as more material was removed, the less the lathe shimmied around. But it was the resin infill that was off centre, so it would be a while until the blank was totally balanced. Switching to the full-size carbide cutter, I removed the outer layer of material from the resin feature ring. You might be able to pick out a crunching, rattling sound. That's the bearing in the tailstock centre. For some reason it started doing this. I'm not sure why. It may be that the bearing is wearing out. But anyway, I kept going, removing just enough until the shiny surface had gone. At this stage I wasn't sure how the finished piece would look. There was enough material in the base to form a pedestal, but I've done a lot of those, so I was considering a more simple design. But again, I had options. Should I curve the base round into a flat base, or should I cut an OG shape from the base up into the resin? I couldn't make my mind up, so I thought I'd just see what happened, and as I progressed, perhaps the shape would just reveal itself. After getting the upper section closer to its finished shape, I concentrated on the lower section. First off, I used the parting tool to cut a foot, or maybe this could be the finished diameter. Then I removed material with a bowl gouge, and for a few seconds I thought about giving in to the pedestal, but thought better of it and switched to forming the OG shape. The OG seemed to be the way to go, but in my enthusiasm, I managed to get a couple of good catches, but I was still a way off the finished surface, so it didn't matter so much. Shear scraping with a gouge soon took care of the damage, and as a consequence, it forced me to cut deeper, forming a more pronounced curve. Another catch on the base convinced me that I had to slow down a bit. I also switched to the bigger half-inch bowl gouge. This has a grind better suited to shear scraping the curves. The outer surface was getting close to being finished, but sadly I got some shavings on the camera lens, which progressively got worse, so I'll quickly skip through a few clips to the next bit. Sorry about that, I'm normally on the ball keeping the shavings at bay, but things got away from me a bit. Quickly moving on, with the outside done and sanded to 120 grit, I began shaping the inside. For this I used a mid-sized carbide finisher, fitted with a standard cutter. Using the standard carbide cutter is a new thing to me. I had to be careful on the resin as it can cause some chipping, but when I let it loose on the sapele segments, it tore into them. It's so good I'm thinking about having two sets of carbide tools, one with standard cutters and one set with negative rate cutters. With a lot of the waste removed, I switched to the full-size carbide with a negative rate cutter. This has a much more gentle cutting action, and using it I began smoothing the inner surface, taking out the tool marks. This is quite a large bowl, measuring 12 inches or 300mm across the rim, but I wanted it to be fairly light, so I decided to make the sidewall thickness around 8mm or 5/16 of an inch. I felt this would suit the piece, and having a solid base, it would be well balanced. The shape was mostly done. What remained was thinning it down, blending and fairing the curves. For this I used a large negative rate scraper with a bit of help from the full-size carbide on the tighter curves and flattening the bottom of the bowl. One of the benefits of segmented bowls is that there isn't as much material to hollow out, so after a few more gentle passes with a scraper, the inside was done. Then I sanded, both inside and out, from 80 to 600 grit, continuing up to 3000 grit on the epoxy resin. This was followed with a thorough clean down with denatured alcohol. Then sanding sealer, 2 coats, each one de-nibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. And up next, Yorkshire Grit abrasive paste, just a single coat, thoroughly cleaned away until no more residue is picking up on the paper towel. Then the resin polishing. First, Mirka Polarshine 10, just a single coat, thoroughly cleaned away, ready for the next stage. Polarshine 5, just another single application, thoroughly cleaned away to leave a deep shine. And to finish, Hampshire Sheen Gloss Finishing Wax, 2 coats, buffed with paper towel to seal and protect the surface. And that's it, another project finished. And I think this one turned out great. I really like it, and I hope you like it too. The simple design with the 3-colour resin, along with the chatoyance in the sapele, make this piece stand out. It's definitely one for the display cabinet. And so, with that said, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please subscribe, a thumbs up would be much appreciated, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.